Inverse trig. Now, to talk about inverses, you have to remember the horizontal line test. If you think of any trig function, they all fail them miserably. Like y equals sine of x. If I start going ahead and drawing it, like automatically, okay, nope, doesn't pass horizontal line test. So what do? We restrict the domain. Sine inverse only exists from 0 to pi over 2, and then backwards to negative pi over 2. Where cosine inverse, ready, can go from 0 all the way to pi before it does not pass the horizontal line test. So what does this mean for you? In short, inverse, sine, cosecant, and tangent will only exist in quadrants 1 and quadrants 4. Now, why am I saying 1 and 4? Because 0 to pi over 2 is in quadrant 1, and 0 to negative pi over 2 is in quadrant 4 along the unit circle. So do be careful. It's not the same over here. Now, if we're talking about the unit circle, 0 to pi over 2, and then 0 to negative pi over 2 is where inverse sine, inverse cosecant, and inverse tangent will exist. Then for cosine, inverse, cosine, secant, and cotangent will exist in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2, because it's one quadrant where cosine is positive and one quadrant where cosine is negative, and 0 to pi would go from here to here. So what does that mean for you? Well, some questions you may encounter. Where's sine inverse of 1/2? So basically in your mind, you're going, what is the angle? Like an inverse trig function gives you back the angle. So sine equals 1/2 at pi over 6. Look at your unit circle or your sine cosine tangent chart, it'll be pi over 6. But then sine inverse of negative 1/2 would be negative pi over 6, because that's what it would be in quadrant 4. Pi over 6, negative pi over 6. It's not 11 pi over 6, because we're restricted by what the answers can be. Remember, we only have a part of the overall domain. So you might see 11 pi over 6 as an answer and go, nope, that is not inside negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Cosine inverse of 1/2. Where does cosine equal 1/2? That's a pi over 3. So therefore, cosine inverse of negative 1/2 is not negative pi over 3, because cosine exists in quadrant 1 and 2. It's not over here at all. Also, in quadrant 4, cosine's positive anyway, so that couldn't be the answer. It's going to be 2 pi over 3, the equivalent angle in quadrant 2. So you might be asked to find inverse trig of various values. You might be asked to find inverse trig from a trig function itself, sine of 7 pi over 6. And so one way to approach this is to figure out basically the two possible answers you can be in. It's either in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. It's either going to be the reference angle pi over 6 or negative reference angle negative pi over 6. That's the only answer sine inverse can be in this case, given this angle. 7 pi over 6 itself is in quadrant 3, where we know sine is negative, so it's got to be where the answer would be negative. Similarly, for cosine, you're either in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2, so you're either pi over 6, the reference angle, or 5 pi over 6. It's not the same as over here. Well, 7 pi over 6 is in quadrant 3, where cosine is negative, so therefore the answer has got to be 5 pi over 6. And then lastly, if you're asked to find the trig of an inverse trig, well, this is just dealing with the ratio of sides. Because again, an inverse trig function gives you an angle, which means tangent of that angle is -2. That's how you go back. Well, we know tangent is going to be opposite over adjacent. So it's going to be 2 over 1. And we know opposite squared plus adjacent squared will equal to hypotenuse squared for a right triangle. So basically 2 squared plus 1 squared equals hypotenuse squared. So hypotenuse is going to be the square root of 5. Well, I want sine of that angle, and sine is opposite over hypotenuse over SOHCAHTOA. Now, positive or negative, you always got to ask yourself positive or negative. What quadrant are we in? It didn't tell you, you have to know. It's tan inverse of -2. Remember, going all the way back, sine, cosecant, and tangent are either in quadrant 1 and 4. If you're positive, you're in quadrant 1, negative, you must be in quadrant 4. And in quadrant 4 would be negative. So that would be the answer. If they rationalize it, it'd be -2 root 5 over 5. And there you go with several examples and the background of inverse trig.